Hi everyone, welcome to pre-record session 1 for Enfield Child Sexual Abuse Training. In this session, I'm going to invite you to listen to some research that we have currently on how and who we're accessing children and young people around concerns of child sexual abuse. And then when we get to the live session, I'm going to invite you to think about how we can make a difference in the work that we do. So what you can see here in the first infographic is that there is far more child sexual abuse taking place in our communities than we know about. In fact, only 1 in 8 children come to the attention of professionals currently. So what we do know is that there are a lot of children that we're not seeing. And maybe some of that is that we're not picking up on the signs and indicators. And what I'm going to present to you is some of the blind spots that we have around particular children in our community. And hopefully this will help us to think about how we can do things differently so those children don't slip through the net. And so to illustrate that point, here we have a current slide from the CSA Centre, which shows us that, for example, currently 2,700 children roughly are on a child protection plan because of sexual abuse. However, 50,000 children are assessed at risk of sexual abuse. And in comparison, 103,000 sexual offences are recorded by the police. So we're estimating that 500,000 children are sexually abused every year, and yet only 2,700 of them have a plan. What we also know about current research is that sexual abuse is just as common as other types of childhood abuse, but the concerns around sexual abuse are much less likely to be identified and named. So you can see in this infographic, sexual abuse is the very small part of the graph at the bottom. We're much more successful at identifying things like neglect or emotional abuse. And so what I'm going to invite you to think about is why that is. What is it that stands in the way? And how can we change the way that we work so that the numbers of children who are receiving appropriate support from services more accurately reflect the amount of children that are experiencing those types of abuse. You can see here from this infographic, again from the CSA Centre, that where you live makes a difference to whether you are going to be identified as being a child that's experienced sexual abuse. So for instance, if you're in the North East, it's 12.8 children per 1,000 who are identified. However, if you're in the east of England, it comes down to 2.8. So there's no logical reason to think that the experiences are different geographically. What is different is the way that we understand and recognise and assess and accommodate children where we think they may have been suffering from sexual abuse. This is why we're talking about attitudes and values today, because some of this we can assume is down to how able we are to recognise that, and some of the reason behind not recognising those things is attitudes and values, and discrimination gets in the way. So 2/3 of all child sexual abuse cases are likely to be attributed to in and around the family environment. It's rarely an isolated incident, and it may go on for many years. And this type of abuse, family-based abuse, is particularly traumatic because of the levels of betrayal, stigma, and secrecy that go with that, because of the relationship, because of the grooming process, because it's somebody that the child may well hold in high regard and may well have a lot of love for. So which children are missing then from identification and assessment and support? Well, we know that children from Black and minority ethnic communities are not represented in terms of the statistics around, who lives in which communities, that there is a lack of identification within that group. We also know that we're less likely to pick up on females as perpetrators of abuse. We're also less likely to pick up on males as victims of abuse. So gender stereotypes and race all get in the way of us being able to identify what might be happening. Even though sibling abuse, for instance, is one of the most common forms of abuse, we're only really starting to see those cases come through in terms of children's services. And again, it's the most likely form of abuse within a family setting. So in theory, sibling abuse should be one of the most common forms of abuse that we are working with currently. The other area that we are struggling with, and I see this a lot in training sessions, is being able to identify children with disabilities and learning difficulties where there may be signs and indicators. What often happens is that some of those signs and indicators become attributed to the disability or the learning difficulty and therefore aren't recognised in terms of indicators, which they would be if they were seen in a child who doesn't have that disability, for instance. So if you think about the areas where we know that discrimination takes place, which is around gender, around race, around disability, these are all reflected and played out in the way that we also identify and assess child sexual abuse. To share some data with you that I think is very interesting from a piece of research called Children's Narratives of Sexual Abuse by Jackson et al. In the Child and Family Social Work publication. In those calls, children talked about female abusers, and 17% of those were females. So that's a really big chunk of female abusers being identified through conversations that those young people had with Childline. What we also know from that piece of research is that when a female abuser was discussed by the young person, it was more often a male victim than a female victim. So again, we're less likely to see males as victims of sexual abuse, and potentially we're even less likely to see that as a female perpetrator. And if you think about the way that those cases are managed in the media, our stereotypes, our perceptions around young men being abused by older women, it's definitely very different to how we would regard a young woman being abused by an older male. Here we have some statistics on sibling abuse. This is estimated as being 5 times the rate of parent-child sexual abuse. Much more likely to see sibling abuse in a family than parent abuse. A quarter of all child sexual abuse cases involving a perpetrator under the age of 18. So 1/4 of all sexual abuse cases are likely to be another young person. So thinking about peer abuse as well as sibling abuse. And these statistics come from the CSA Centre briefing on sibling sexual abuse. And they've just produced a new guide on sibling sexual behaviour, which came out in 2023, which I suggest you download because, it's a really useful piece of research and guidance in an area that we historically haven't had a lot of information or confidence in knowing how to deal with this type of abuse. Thinking now about children with disabilities and learning difficulties, we know from the research there's a higher incidence of abuse than peers who haven't been diagnosed with a disability. So if you have a disability or a learning difficulty, you are statistically more likely to experience sexual abuse and sexual exploitation, for instance. We know that there's also a poor recording of the prevalence and need within this community of children. And maybe for some of the reasons that I mentioned before, that we're not as skilled as being able to identify it. Many of these children don't have a voice. Some might be non-verbal, or they don't have a voice theoretically because the way that our society sets up communication makes it more difficult for those children to be heard, to be believed, to have discussions about sex, to have sex education. So we're just much more likely to do all of the early stages of work with those children and the relationship building, which then enables those children to share with us their experiences. We know there's issues around children's capacity to understand what happens to them. They're very dependent on carers. Many children, they may communicate differently or not be understood in the way that they communicate, and their understanding and our understanding of what is happening to them, again, may be different to a peer who didn't have a disability or a learning difficulty. So we need to think about how can we change these things? How can we, for instance, do some of the work around safe touch and boundaries? And I put here a reference from the NSPCC's learning portal, where there is a specific section called Love Life, which is aimed at children with disabilities, which will be very useful, I think, for you to find. So this is the last slide in this first pre-record, and thank you so much for listening. But before you go, I'm going to invite you to just have a couple of minutes reflection on the research that I've presented, and think about what you can bring back to the group to discuss at our next meeting. And in that meeting, I'll be presenting a film around similar issues, and then I'm going to invite you to talk to your colleagues about what it is that you can do in your services, in your roles, that's going to help eradicate the discrimination that some children face in terms of identification and support. So we will be looking at least one practical thing that everyone can do, and we'll share those as a larger group. So you can start to think about that now. I look forward to hearing what you've got to say in the next session.